Hello CS112. Today we'll be going over a quick solution to Lab 2, which has to do with more Python basics, but this time working with functions. So to go over what exactly you're supposed to do here, you're supposed to create a function called calculate hypotenuse, where you would be given a and b of the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And you were to use this formula here to calculate c. So A and B are user input, so you would need to first ask the user for the length of side A and B of the right triangle, and then use those two values you got from your input to call this function to calculate what C is. So given this formula, we can infer that to calculate C, we would need to take A squared plus B squared, and then find the square root of that, and that's going to be what C is. So just to start off, I am going to copy the exact function signature that was given to us on the assignment PDF. And then I'm not going to have anything in it yet, but this is where my code will go. Now that I am back, now that I'm back outside of my function, the first thing I'm going to need to do is actually ask the user for these inputs. So this is actually a quick example run here. So it looks like we want to actually print out hypotenuse calculator before asking for the inputs. So the very first thing I'm going to do is hypotenuse calculator. I think that's right. And then after that is when I'm going to start asking for my inputs. So something, if you looked through all of the example runs, is that you returned a float. So I'm just going to create a variable called a and set that equal to float inputs. And then in here is where I will display that message that I copied here. I'm going to add a space at the end so it looks nicer in my terminal. And I'm going to do the same thing with B. So floats, inputs. Hopefully you guys are input masters by now. Of this triangle here, going to close that off real quick with that space at the end. Okay, so now I have essentially built up to about here. Now is the hard part where I have to actually calculate the hypotenuse. So now is when I'm going to actually call the function. So I'm going to say result, and I'm going to set that equal to what this function will return. So what this function will return fed in these two parameters that we just got from the user. So now, when I set a variable equal to a function name with those parameters that I've defined, it's going to call this function with those two parameters, and whatever this function will return, it will be stored into this variable here. And then you want to display what you got here. So I'm just going to say print, boom, and then I'm going to put a comma and result. And now that should work. That should be what this is. We just have to do the math inside of here now. So we're just given this variable. So I'm just going to Control C it here. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to square A and I'm going to square B. So I'm just going to say it's A equals A squared and B equals B squared. So now we've taken care of those squaring that we need to do because we know that A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So now I'm just going to say, create a new variable called a, b, and I'm going to set that equal to a plus b. So what just happened? A plus b. So now that we have that, we have kind of solved this left side of the equation here. Now we need to find a way to get rid of this square on the c side so we can just have c alone, basic algebra. So that would just be finding the square roots of each side. So now we need to find the square root of this. And I'm just going to create another variable called final value, or let's just call it final, equals. Now, how can I find the square root of AB? Well, lucky enough for us, we know that the square root is the same thing as squaring something by 1/2. Now, if you just left it like this, you would get the incorrect answer. So when squaring something by a fraction in Python, there are going to be some order of operation issues. And in order to avoid those, you just slap it in parentheses. And in fact, it's always good when you have multiple step mathematical equations like this to have parentheses just to make everything safe. This is the only line that's using two things, is finding a square root as well as division, but it's always good to just to be safe and save you from a lot of headache. Just wrap everything in parentheses. So lastly, we are just going to return final. So if we just wanted to trace this real quick, if it was called with 3 and 4, so 3 being A and 4 being B, you would first say A equals A squared, which is 9. So A is now 9. B is now going to be 16. Then you are going to say AB is equal to 16 plus 9, which is going to be 25. And lastly, you're going to find the square root of 25, which is 5, and you're going to return that. So hopefully we will get this exact output run here. So what I'm going to do again is save this file. So Control or Command S. Then I'm going to run Python, or I think it's Py for me. And then the name of my file is going to ask me to input the length of leg A, length of leg B, and it's going to calculate the length of the hypotenuse is 5.0. Again, if we didn't have this in parentheses, I'm just going to demonstrate what a lot of people were running into. So 3, 4, you get 12.5, which makes no sense. That is because the order of operations is getting a little janky here. So, like I said, it's always good to wrap everything in parentheses just to be safe. It's also, in my opinion, makes it a little more readable when you're just running through lines of code. If you have a lot of math, it's also a lot more readable, in my opinion. So if you've had any more questions, do let us know. The last thing I will mention is that you needed to do all of this stuff after you defined the definition. Well, specifically, you needed to do this line right here after you made the definition. The way Python will read this file as soon as you type in Python followed by your cat name, so it will start at the first line of actual code. So obviously it's going to skip all these comments, skip all the empty lines, go right to here. It's going to read that, okay, there is a function called calculate hypotenuse on line 13. Then it's going to jump to line 22, 23, 24, 25, and then it's going to say, okay, now it's actually calling this function here, and it's going to go back up and actually enter this function. So before you actually call this function, it can't actually be entered. So that means if I was to use this if I was to move this guy up here, like so, it would say calculate hypotenuse is not defined. Because it starts at line 12, it'll say, okay, result equals this function call. Well, we don't know what this function is because it has not gotten to that step yet. So these orderings are always very important. Again, similar to what like this, I did need to define A and B before I used A and B in my thing here. It's just good to always think that Python will be reading from your first line of code down. So if you tried using A and B or tried asking for A and B after you tried using A and B, they wouldn't be defined.